Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to talk about the books that I read in February before we get too far into March, and I feel like I'm already quite excited about March because of Middle Grey March and March Mystery Madness, so I wanted to wrap up the books that I read in February. The first book that I finished in the month was The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is obviously the second book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It continues on with the Fellowship. At the end of the first book, the Fellowship is split up. Something happens and they're split up into smaller groups, and so a big chunk of this book you're following different sets of the original cast, and because of that I enjoyed this book much less in comparison to The Fellowship of the Ring, because my favorite characters are the hobbits, and out of the hobbits my favorite characters are Frodo and Sam, and you don't actually get to see them appear in the book until probably half of the book has already passed you by. And so because of that, it took me quite a while to get into this book. I don't really like the epic aspects of the Lord of the Rings books in general. I much prefer the way that the sort of the psychology of the journey, the way that Frodo and Sam and the rest of them conquer their fears, find motivation to continue going even when it's really hard, even when they're constantly in danger. And with especially the parts of the company that is non-Hobbit, there's much more like epicness to their storylines. It's much more focused on war and on the warrior culture, basically. So I enjoyed this book much more when you came to Frodo and Sam, and it does end up in a really exciting part of the story. So I'm looking forward to continuing on with The Return of the King, that I will be continuing on with soon, together with Yamini from The Skeptical Reader and Mary from Books and Pizza. The next two books are books that I've already done a full video review on, so I won't go into too much detail here. But the first is My Salinger Year by Joanna Rakoff. This is a memoir of the writer working for the literary agency that represented J.D. Salinger. So it follows her working in the middle of the 90s for this literary agency, and during that time there is a big deal being planned for one of J.D. Salinger's short stories to be published by a small press, and the literary agency is sort of responsible for or is at least part of the making of the deal, all of the planning surrounding the publication of this short story. It would have been a pretty big deal since nothing new had been published by him since the 60s. It didn't happen, and you get the insider story of why it fell through. It is also about Joanna Rakoff's transitioning from being a student to working her first job, and the job itself is kind of a central aspect of her life in this point in time, which I found really interesting and fun and engaging to read. So while I loved the aspects that dealt with Salinger, it is also a really good and engaging memoir. So even if you're not a Salinger fan, I think you might enjoy this if you are into the mid-90s New York setting, with someone sort of finding their purpose and finding what they want to do with their life. And the other book that I also read related to Salinger is J.D. Salinger, A Life by Kenneth Slawenski. So this is a much more straightforward biography of J.D. Salinger. It starts with his upbringing and really strong relationship with his mother, to go throughout his school years and the war, and the way that the war affected him both physically and mentally, as well as the way that it shaped his writing. It talks about his writing career and the progression of that, especially all of the work that he did prior to The Catcher in the Rye. I think it raises a lot of interesting questions to do with the artist's rights to control their work, and as well as things related to copyright. So I found it very informative and very interesting, because I find Salinger a really interesting person to read about. I would say that this is quite dully written, because it's very neutrally sort of presented to you. It feels like a very respectful biography that isn't too intrusive. So I like that about it, but I also think that it isn't a biography I would recommend to someone who isn't interested in Salinger. Next, I listened to 2 audiobooks this month. The first was I Was Anastasia by Ariel Lawhon, narrated by Jane Collingwood and Sean Thomas. So I mentioned this in my recent audiobook favorites video that will be linked. But this book is basically a historical fiction novel that's told in 2 timelines. So first is Anastasia Romanov and sort of the last 2 weeks of her life at the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, and the other timeline is Anne Anderson, I think starting with the 70s and going backwards in time, so that the timelines eventually come together. And Anne Anderson is the woman who claimed to be Anastasia Romanov. So the story itself is sort of, it has already been proven by this point, I think in the late 90s, that Anne Anderson was lying, that she was not Anastasia. But this novel sort of takes the premise of what if that was the case, what if it was true, and reading the book makes you think it's possible. It's very atmospheric and the setting is completely transporting, I felt. Both timelines and both characters are really engaging to read and follow. I think one of the things that keeps both, that is sort of a common thread with both of the timelines, is some of the hardships that both characters have to go through because of the fact that they're women. Some aspects to do with the loss of choice and of being not subdued, but being controlled by other people, and especially by men, and having to fear that. I think in general it's just a really engaging historical fiction novel, and I've written a full review of this, so I will link that along with all the other reviews in the description in case you're interested. But I thought this was fantastic, and is also really fantastically narrated, which is why I mentioned it in the audiobook video thing. The narration is split, so one narrator is responsible for one character, which I think really helps in separating the timelines, because it's told in parallel chapters. And one of the timelines is, as I said, going backwards in time, which could easily be confusing in the audiobook, but it isn't at all. So I loved it. I think it is fantastic, and I would highly recommend this if you're into historical fiction, or you're interested in the Romanov mystery aspect of it. That I would highly recommend giving this a listen, especially recommend the audiobook, but I thought the book in general was fantastic. The next audiobook I listened to was The Door by Magda Szabo, translated by Lynn Briggs and narrated by Sean Thomas. So I listened to another audiobook narrated by this woman because I fell in love with her voice in I Was Anastasia. And so I was looking for other books that she had narrated, and this was one of them. I thought, again, it was fantastic. The Door follows a writer couple who are so busy with their work that they need to hire a housekeeper. And they're recommended a woman called Emerence by one of their friends. And Emerence is very different from other people that they know. She asks for references from the writer couple to even consider working for them. So the way that the power dynamics of the trio is very different right from the start. But the relationship of Emerence and the woman in the writer couple she's never named, that's why I keep mentioning her as that. It is sort of the central aspect of this book. It's a character study of them, of their lives, and the way that their relationship builds from almost a dislike, becomes something familial in their relationship, but it also ends up in a quite sad way. And that sadness is something that is carried out throughout the book because it's hinted at that it ended badly from the beginning of the book. This book is, as I said, is a character study, close up of them and their everyday and some of the things that happens in their lives that bring them closer together. But it's also about the way that age impacts a person, especially having to be dependent on other people. I found those parts of the story heartbreaking to read, and how other people make choices for you. Part of Emerenzi's background is also ridden with war and with misery, and it's sort of a historical aspect to the story as well. There's something about the writing that really reminds me of Agota Kristof, who was the writer of the Notebook trilogy that I loved in 2017. I think. So if you have read Magda Szabo's books and you haven't read Agota Kristof, I would highly recommend picking those books up and the other way around. I loved this book, and I am definitely going to be continuing on with reading Magda Szabo's other books. The last book that I finished in February is called Liquid Rules: The Delightful and Dangerous Substances That Flow Through Our Lives by Miodownik. This is the author who also wrote Stuff Matters, and I've had him on my radar for a while because I've been looking into chemistry, popular science books, and this is basically that. It is a book taking you through various different substances, various different liquids, and talking about the history surrounding that liquid, the use, the development of it, as well as the chemistry and biology behind it, so to speak. Things like alcohol, water, liquid soap, I think honey is one of them as well, and various different liquids. And part of it is a close look at that one liquid in one chapter, is focusing on one specific liquid, and the history, as I said, and all of the other things. Part of the book is also just a general look at liquids and the way that they differ from solids and gas, and some of the chemistry that is characteristics of liquids in general. I got a NetGalley of this. I should have said that at the beginning. I got a NetGalley after requesting it because I was really interested in reading more chemistry related books, and I found this very accessible, very easy to read. It is formatted so that the whole book is structured after one airplane journey that the author has, and various different liquids that he comes across in his journey. I found this gimmick to be unnecessary for the book. It's still very accessible, the information itself, and there's a lot of interesting tidbits in it. I found myself learning a lot and asking and sharing the knowledge that I learned to anyone who would listen. I had a lot of fun reading it and processing the information, especially to do with alcohol and food. My main issue with the book is actually the structure itself. So I wish that it was more clear that it was a specific set of liquids that was going to be discussed in the book. Partly I wish the structure of the chapters themselves were organized better, so that the history and the use of the liquid was separate from the scientific aspects of it, so it was easier for me to organize my thoughts as well. I would recommend it if you are looking for a popular science chemistry book. Just kind of bear in mind that the structure is the way it is, so you know what to expect. I am definitely planning to read his other book as well, Stuff Matters, because I think it's probably a good foundation for me to get into reading chemistry, popular science. And this book came out in February, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So those are the books that I read in February. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you're planning to read any of these books. Let me know also if what you read in February and loved or really enjoyed. I would love to hear about it in the comments. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!